Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
I want to talk to you about going to the other side in a section in Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, 35 through to 41. Mark's Gospel is by this time moving at a pace, truly reaching a sense of energy about the verses. If you look at the way they're connected and the pace of the gospel, you certainly become aware of the intensity of the ministry of Jesus. And the sheer energy of the gospel throbs on every page. And the context that we have as we read the closing verses of chapter 4 is that Jesus has been engaged in an extensive period of teaching. If you read the verses before, you will see that Jesus has been teaching in parables. Indeed, there are 4 that are presented to us, and they are indelible stories as we recall the ministry of Jesus. We have the parable of the sower, the lamp on a stand. We have the parable of the growing seed and the parable of the mustard seed. So they represent, if you like, an energized period of teaching in the ministry of Jesus. And following a busy day of teaching and ministry, at Jesus' suggestion, he and his disciples head over to what is clearly the quieter side of the lake. So much of Jesus' ministry takes place around Lake Galilee. Now, Mark doesn't indicate on which side this is, but we can certainly do some serious and I think meaningful conjecture about it all. We can hazard a reasonable conclusion that he was teaching around Capernaum, which of course is the center of his ministry, not Bethlehem and Nazareth, but Capernaum. That's where he seemed to center so much of that time of ministry. And while it's centered there, that's reinforced by what we read in chapter 5, because by the time we begin chapter 5, we can locate where Jesus is after this incident when we read that they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. So that tells us that maybe we're on the Capernaum side, which is at the northwestern side, across the lake to a much quieter place. Lake Galilee is sometimes misunderstood, I think, when it's described as the Sea of Galilee. And part of the reason for that is early writers that chose the word sea rather than lake. It is, of course, not a sea. It's an inland lake. It's an inland lake of significant size. And one of the important features about this lake is it is 200 meters below sea level. And it's hard for us to grasp that in our own mind, but the lake, which is Galilee, is well below sea level. It's why further up, if you go to En-Gedi, there you come to the place where people know what it is to float in the sea and all the rest of it further up. The reality is that it is so low. That's important in understanding the storms, actually. So what we have are hills on either side, a very low lake that is the source of endless gospel stories. So much happens around this lake. Having visited the Holy Land on a lot of occasions, I hope to return there in the next 2 or 3 years, incidentally. I'm always pleased when I take people there to take them on Lake Galilee. Because of its geographical setting, because of its altitude, and the sudden upsurge of winds, this incident that we have of a storm is not strange. It's the kind of things that regularly happened. It's the kind of thing that happens without warning and takes people aside. I think some people, you think you've got it to order. You take them on the lake and it's quiet. You read a Bible passage and suddenly the boat starts rocking because that's the way the winds get caught up in what is really a long lake. And one that has length rather than breadth about it. And when you look at it on a map, you'll see how important that is. One writer concluded this: violent storms are common, and evening storms coinciding with the fall of darkness are particularly dangerous. No doubt the disciples were anticipating a gentle crossing. That's what they assumed, and all of them were ready for rest. In Mark's Gospel, we read these details. There were also other boats with him. Now, why does Mark choose to tell us that? There were other boats there. Well, I think what he's saying, very simply, as he reminded us this, there's nobody was expecting what happened. It was quite a normal thing. Many people were crossing the lake, maybe at the end of a day. Nobody was expecting what was suddenly to arise. Jesus is asleep in the stern of the boat, and the disciples are taken up and overtaken with panic at what actually happens. And they reach out to awaken him. They address Jesus with the words of what I would hold as a text before you. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? I explore that text from the perspective of Jesus asleep in the boat, the disciples in their panic, and the calm that ensued. Those three aspects. Before opening each of them up, I draw your attention to two important matters. First, this is what is often known as a nature miracle. And they are the most difficult for people to get hold of and understand. The purpose of them has to really be examined very carefully. Walter Wessel reminds us, miracles of this kind seem to present the greatest problem to our contemporary world. He's right, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that the New Testament draws something very specific out of this nature miracles and some of the others. And that is that Jesus Christ is not just Lord of the church, but is Lord of the whole of creation. That's an important truth that is reinforced in a miracle of this kind. And remember, when we read Paul's writings, when Paul, in that marvelous first chapter of his letter to the Colossians, wrote this: "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So both Paul and the gospel writers have this understanding that we so often do not get, and that is that Jesus Christ is Lord of creation. The cosmos is the way that Paul would have written it to the Colossians. The second matter is that there's a definite sense of eyewitness about these words in Mark. Perhaps it's the unique relationship between Mark and Peter, because there is no doubt that Peter would appear to be the source, maybe, of the stories that we read in Mark, that helps us to understand that. What other reason would there be to remind us there were other boats there? If you wanted to tell the story, you don't need that detail. But if you were there, that detail would be important to you. There's a sharp exchange going on in the life of the church. And there's no doubt at all that this particular passage helps us to see that Jesus is more than merely the one who teaches the truth, but one who demonstrates the truth. So let's look at it from these three perspectives. Firstly, the Lord sleeps. I think this reveals something of the composure of Christ. This is the only reference in the Gospels to Jesus being asleep. Now, it's not because we do not get indications of the humanity of Jesus. We're told he's thirsty in John's Gospel. We're told he's tired. But here Jesus is asleep. Now, it's not the only reference to sleeping, because there are some quite negative connotations. Remember, Jesus took the disciples up the mountainside. They fell asleep, even though they've been told to stay awake and pray with him. And so there is something interesting in all of this. Here's another detail, and Mark is the master of detail. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. Now, why do we get that? This would tell me that he deliberately went to sleep. Now, there are times after a hard day's work that you can sit down and have a nap, and you fall asleep. And if you are a man, and there are many of us here tonight, I think that if your wife or partner saw you taking a cushion and putting it behind your head, this would not be falling asleep. This would be deliberately choosing to be asleep. Now, I think that the cushion is important. It's not only indication of detail, but it gives us an indication that Jesus intended to go to sleep. He had no fear about this trip in the boat. There was nothing about the journey that made him feel he got to stay awake to make sure everything was right. He went to sleep in the boat. And throughout the whole narrative in Mark's gospel here, there's evidence of Jesus exhibiting a wonderful sense of composure. Despite the most challenging of circumstances, nowhere more so on the cross than in the occurrences of his suffering, Jesus had a composure that meant that whatever was happening outside of him, there was a peace and serenity and trust that all who observed would be alive and alert to. Now, there are many expressions of Christianity which encourage and even make promises along the lines of if you trust Jesus and you're part and parcel of our understanding of the Christian faith, nothing's ever going to go wrong. There are not going to be any storms. And there's nothing going to be dismay. Whatever we do, please, we can't use the gospel as that example. Because even Jesus, the Son of God, knew what it was to have to face those realities in life that he is unprepared for. And I think that gives us a great insight. Donald English pointed out that they led to frustration and despair. They actually point the disciple toward the wrong goal in the Christian pilgrimage. It is enough that Christ goes with us on our journey. That's all we need. We don't need the assurance that there will be no storms, but we do need the assurance that, as John Newton picked up with Christ in the vessel, we can smile at the storm. With Christ asleep on the cushion in the boat, there is nothing to fear. Even though the storm may actually be roaring around us, as other hymn writers and poets have so wonderfully expressed. His care is not minimized because of a difficult journey. And there are many of us here that know what it means to see faith not merely as something that bounces along like some kind of topsy-turvy enjoyment fairground ride, but because actually life has its struggles, has its difficulties. However, we can be assured that Christ is with us. I think that's very pastorally important. I think it's spiritually sustaining and can give us all kinds of possibilities of hope. Our discipleship is not greater or lesser because we know what it is to encounter stormy seas. There are some people that ask the question when life is difficult, is there something wrong with my faith? Is there something wrong with the way that we're understanding faith that we're having to face this challenge? And the answer, of course, is no, not at all. The normative picture is that we know some storms in our lives. Our discipleship is not greater or lesser because we encounter strong seas. And the composure of Jesus Christ is manifest in the most challenging of situations. I try to imagine what would this passage have sounded like in the life of the early church if it was read out at a time when some of them were facing particular challenges. I'm led to believe that if you were to fly into the eye of a hurricane, you experience a great calm. So peaceful that even birds are caught up in the midst of it. As you peer upward, you see not the clouds and only blue sky. It's hard to imagine that you might be in the midst of the storm. Jesus found himself in the eye of the storm. Surrounding him was the tempest, but his spirit was cradled in the presence of the Father's peace. In the presence of the Father's peace. The disciples might well have been pounded by the tempest of fear, but they'd not yet learned. And only much later would they learn what it was to enter into the eye of the storm through faith in God. And faith is such a critical aspect. It tells us in verse 40 that Jesus asked the question, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So it was a matter of faith. in being able to be in the midst of the storm and to continue. The disciples were learning in this momentous crossing of the Lake of Galilee that the greatest danger lay not outside the boat, but inside the boat. The greatest challenges were not the storm, but being able to face the storm within their own lives. It's important for us to understand, I think, this composure of Christ. Unfortunately, storms that rage within us can't be cured by ourselves. In order to still the inward raging, we need the power of God's love. The community of the early church had to face many such storms, and every community of faith faces them. It is vital that we recognize that our Lord Jesus Christ is the bringer of peace. He's the one that keeps us calm in the midst of all the challenges. So the Lord sleeps, revealing the composure of Christ. Secondly, the disciples panic. This is their lack of trust amongst this band of disciples. So whilst there is a peace, there's also a panic. And this panic that was going on is something that expresses the nature of the disciples. As we've already reminded ourselves, storms on Galilee arise unexpectedly. The fact that they have much to say to us as well as to the first disciples. Sometimes the storms of life can appear suddenly. And sometimes it is those storms that challenge the very nature of our faith, the very nature of our Christian discipleship. And in those storms, it is wonderful to know that we need not be like the disciples in panic. Through his composure that we have encountered, discovered, observed, we too may find that peace. It's the kind of experience I think that the disciples faced as they cried out for God's intervention. The juxtaposition of Jesus sleeping in the boat and the disciples' pandemonium is striking. Mark helps us to see, I think, the humanity of Jesus in his tiredness, as we meet it elsewhere in his hunger, his thirst, and indeed his pain. We must focus our minds on the fact that these were experienced fishermen. Note that, not amateurs, not people who had never been on the sea or Lake Galilee. They are men for whom they had made their living and made those important judgment calls. Should we go out now or not? So for them to be frightened, for them to be challenged, seems to me to have a message within it, and one that all of us can take and understand. Certainly this was not to be expected, what happened here. Extremely experienced people. Here at Wesley Mission, some of our most significant services are helping people in the midst of crisis. I think I have in my mind some of those stories that happen in people's lives, like the family that found itself confronted by the debt collectors. And only a matter of months before, their life seemed to be all stable and all well. They simply turned at the wrong time to the wrong people for the wrong kind of help. And suddenly their life is in a crisis. It can happen with illness and sickness. It can happen in human relationships. It can happen to people who observe in their friends that all seems to be well, and the next thing they know is that there's a breakdown of human relationships that it's hard to even begin to imagine. And so we recognize that this picture of things happening suddenly and panic occurring in our lives is not restricted to a Bible passage of long ago, but is part of human experience today. And when we face crisis in our lives, there's no shame in seeking help. I think that's one of the challenges people have. Sometimes they feel to seek help is to do something that might reveal their weakness or somehow expose them in some way that isn't strong. It's okay. And I think Jesus, as he challenges these disciples, is not rejecting them. He's not saying, I don't mind the fact you've woken me up, though I needed a nap. He's not saying that doesn't matter. But I think for all of us, we need to recognize the need for help is there. And this particular point, I think, has much to say to us. We may find ourselves in situations when we wonder whether God is truly beside us in the storms we have to face. As individuals and in our relationships with others, storms can batter us about, they can blow us about, they can cause us to nearly lose our direction and even paralyze us with fear. What we must not do is side with the disciples here. Let's make sure that our eyes are truly on the one who is full of composure rather than the panic that is elicited in the disciples. And then thirdly, as we put those two things together, we recognize the calm that settles everything, the amazement that peace brings. See, the disciples are awestruck. The fear of the storm is now replaced with a new sense of something that brings peace. It's something that they were terrified. You know, when we read in the New Testament they were terrified, it doesn't quite mean what it does now. It's not some horror reaction. They were full of fear, we sometimes read. They are certainly at this moment terrified. They ask themselves, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. They recognize the calm that has been brought about in this situation by our Lord Jesus Christ. And this amazement is really it's little wonder that they asked, who is this? They've seen Jesus. Just think of what they had seen. They had observed Jesus healing the lepers. They had seen Jesus helping paralyzed individuals. Even the early chapters of Mark's Gospel give us insight to the healing touch of Jesus Christ in people's lives. They have seen his willingness to challenge the laws that were easily holding people captive and easily making men and women prisoners. He is Lord of the Sabbath. But he's also Lord of all nature and all creation. Now they recognize that Jesus is able to rebuke the wind and speak calm to the waves. The question of Jesus to the disciples is full of meaning. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Consequently, they became terrified. Jesus wanted his disciples to trust him. Wanted his disciples to have confidence in him. And he calls us because he wants the same confidence from all of us, to have confidence in him. And we build up confidence not at the time of crisis, but throughout our lives. It is there that the investment of faith and prayer and sustenance of a holy relationship with God bears itself out in the time of crisis. Following the ways of God is certainly not to be perceived as a storm-free journey. And if at the moment you are free of storms, you wouldn't want the preacher to put it quite like this, but it's at least a start to our thinking. Beware, it will not always be like this. Have our confidence in the God who keeps us there. And how do you and I respond when things appear so unexpectedly? I wonder if there's been times when you've considered Jesus to be asleep too. You thought he must be on that cushion because I can't find his presence in this situation. Well, his sleeping has nothing to do with his ability to be with us through our crisis. It has to be noted that the following incident in Mark's Gospel is of the demoniac. On the lake, Jesus has brought calm to a howling, raging tempest. Then Jesus brings a similar calm to one whose storm is obviously within. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker says that many of the fears that we grapple with in our lives, they're manifestations of the ultimate fear. And the ultimate fear is death itself. Perhaps he was right. And we must ask ourselves, how can we address this fear? Recently, when I was preparing a piece of work on the Psalms of the Old Testament, my mind was focused on the fact that many Psalms seem to pick up this theme of trust in the most difficult of circumstances and the implications of what that trust means in our lives. As the disciples will soon learn, their trusting in Jesus Christ is what gives them the capacity to be able to face the challenges of life. And in the calm that Jesus brings, his authority and his power is displayed. It's only as we trust the Lord in those difficult places that we really discover that he is with us. When studying the gospel, it's important to ask, what would the impact of these words have upon the first disciples? Maybe upon those disciples that were beginning to fear the knock on the door, that were understanding the struggle of what it meant to be a Christian church when the persecution of Rome was soon to come upon them. Maybe upon those disciples that would have personal challenges in their lives. Maybe as the Christian church was struggling to say, how can we be what we are? You can understand that this is much more than a story of crossing the lake. It's a story of trust. It's a story of hope. Perhaps the early church was beginning to feel that the boat of their community was about to sink. And the style of the passage is rich and poetic. And it would be a positive contribution, I think, to that kind of church. In her very helpful commentary, Sherman Johnson reminds us that it's only here that Mark connects cowardice and lack of faith. It's usually not something he brings together, but he says that our faith gives us confidence. The story is told about Bishop Warren Chandler, after whom the School of Theology in Emory University in North America is named. As he lay on his deathbed, a friend inquired whether or not he was afraid. "Please tell me frankly," he said, "do you fear crossing over the river of death?" "Why?" said Chandler. "I belong to a father who owns the land on both sides of the river." And I think that we ourselves together as the people of faith can embrace that. At this point in the ministry of Jesus, the disciples are learning a very important lesson of faith. Let's leave this place tonight and say, we too want to be with those disciples who stood back and said, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" We need to grasp that peace and embrace it ourselves. Amen.